Da tror jeg vi starter. And I'll do it in English to make sure all of us understand what I'm saying. I didn't meet. I spoke with the current speaker probably like 10 years ago for the first time over email, talking about various kinds of video codecs and how to improve the system with free and open video formats. And I've been tracking the activity for at least 15 years so far. He is famous in my parts of the communities, the free software communities. We all know who Monty is, and I'm very, very happy that we managed to lure him to Norway by marketing the nice scenery and the nice people he would be able to meet here in Oslo and in Bergen. And the triggering event was the release of AV1, which probably most of you already know is the latest of the free and open video codecs. But when he wanted to talk about AV1, I said, well, we could read up on AV1, but can you tell us more about your experiences for the last 25 years struggling with promoting free and open video formats? And that's what I'm looking forward to experience today. I hope the rest of you will enjoy it as much as I plan to do. There you are, Monty. Hello.
Hi, everyone. I will now perform by staring directly into this blue light the entire evening. My name is Monty. I'm here from Mozilla at the moment and Zif.org. I first got into compression as a hobby in about 1993. I come from, of all things, a musical theater background, being very motivated by music but having no special talent for it myself. And as a result, I simply wanted to be around it. I'm a good engineer. So on the production and technical side of music and theater and performance, I found that I had a front row seat more often than not to enjoy it. I'll take a moment to thank Petter because he's been a wonderful guide the whole time I was here, and actually he lured me by inviting my children to the gathering, which went swimmingly. They've enjoyed it and have already asked to come back next year. I enjoyed it too. I very well might. Petter also slightly misrepresented what it was he asked me to do. I said, well, I could talk about AV1, and I believe his words were, do you have something perhaps a little clickbaitier that you could talk about? Maybe we could call it war stories. I thought, oh, well, war stories. Actually, I rather enjoy looking into the blue light. I'm used to it. Like I said, I'm from theater. They're often up overhead, but it's still not all that different. He wanted something clickbaitier, war stories. War stories, free codecs as a struggle? Well, yes, it's been a struggle, but comparing it to war isn't really quite the same. You spend a lot of time preparing for battle, as it were, building things, and there are only those very small moments of terror, but you can't really call it terror either. You make a test run, the results come back, something is the wrong color, and that's all somebody talks about all week. The comparison to battle really doesn't fit, but at the same time, when I attended my first IETF 75 in Stockholm, although other Zif.org members had gone to many IETFs in the past, that was my first, and we were all gathering for the meeting to decide whether or not, to vote on whether or not the codec working group would happen. That's the working group that led to Opus. There was quite a bit of pushback against the idea of standardizing an audio codec within the IETF. Both the ITU and ISO MPEG insisted that they were the proper places to standardize and perform audio codec work. After all, they'd been doing it for some time, and they were the experts. And I had a gentleman. Now, the IETF bills itself as an organization of individuals. Everyone is there as an individual. There are no companies. You're not there for your company, you're there for yourself. That's a polite fiction in a lot of ways, and of course a lot of the companies that did oppose Opus tried to stack the deck as best they could against the vote. This is all perfectly understood and legal, and it's a little bit against the spirit of the thing, but not really. And I had a gentleman come up to me, I remember his name, of course, I remember this all very clearly, but no names here. And he shook my hand and said, "I just wanted to meet the man who's costing all of us our jobs." Perhaps he was put up to it, perhaps it was simply to put me off my game, but I took him at face value, and I still do, and I think we should. So it shows that there are consequences here, perhaps not life-threatening, but the economics of the situation mean that free codecs are a threat to some groups' revenue streams. And we can see from the very beginning that they've pushed back against this, almost from the very beginning. Speaking of the very beginning, Peter asked me to tell stories, so I'm here to tell stories. Conventionally, one tells stories in terms of protagonist and antagonist, or if you would, good guys and bad guys. That's a simplification, but let's go with it. I think you all know who the good guys are. And the bad guys in these stories often tend to end up being the ITU, or especially MPEG. Let's just call it MPEG. MPEG is the bad guys. And that's a little strange because MPEG weren't always the bad guys. MPEG was formed to tackle the same sort of economic problems that the free codecs are taking on now. Specifically, that when companies get together and try to build something, they all want control of it. The thought is that the pushback against codecs is all about money, and I suppose at the end of the day it is. But more than money, the companies want control over what they're using. They want a competitive advantage over everyone else. And for that reason, the MPEG was formed, because if you have a patent on, say, some small part of the MP3 codec system, this patent control it governs adding this number to this number, multiplying by a certain quantity in a filter bank that only applies to MP3. That patent is absolutely worthless unless it's part of MP3. In the wild, the patent means nothing. It cannot be generally applied. If it was generally applicable, even the United States Patent Office would not grant it. But once it's part of a standard, that standard can be held hostage by the patent owner. We've seen that repeatedly, and the problem is getting worse. When MPEG was first formed, the idea was the experts would all come into one room, make the best possible standard, and then a different group would hash out all of the licensing details. So you had the MPEG, who were the technical people, and you had the MPEG licensing authority, who were the patent lawyers, who would sort it all out so that finally there would be a way to centralize all the patents in one place and there would be no infighting. There were two problems with that. The first is, obviously, the MPEG and the MPEG-LA, no matter how much they protest that they are completely different groups with no association between the two, you go to the meetings and notice it's exactly the same people. The second problem is that the primary threat turned out not to be from within. It eventually came from without. And even though the primary threat comes from without, eventually there also started being infighting as groups learned to game the system. It no longer works that you can come up with the best technical solution to a problem and then solve the patent issue, because everybody games this part to get their patents in, whether they're going to be part of the pool or not, or maybe patent things that these guys are working on, or somehow manage to get their licensed IP leverage in there. And by the time you get to sorting it all out at the end, when the specification is complete, it is far too late. In MPEG 1, things were more or less okay. And when I say MPEG 1, I mean MPEG 1, audio layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, the original MPEG video. There was some infighting. There was some patent trolls coming from without. Sysville was one of them, surprise. And with each successive MPEG standard, the problem has gotten worse, to the point where I think it's been 6 years since HEVC was finalized, and we now have 3 patent pools. one of which can't decide whether or not they're going to levy a royalty on streams, and a large group of known patent holders that are outside of all three pools. In fact, those three pools, which are each trying to individually levy their own patent tax on HEVC, don't even represent the majority of the known patent holders. That's a fairly dysfunctional system. So as MPEG has been gamed, they've sort of become the bad guy, not because they started out that way, not because that was the intent, but because they refuse to adapt to the current situation and the current reality. That current reality is the patent situation around standards is broken. Again, because the patent means nothing unless you get it into the pool. Once you get it into the pool, you can single-handedly hold everyone who's using that standard and everyone who's in the original group hostage. So we have to take control out of it. Now, Leo Ciriglione, who is the founder of MPEG, has himself said, it's obvious that the MPEG patent system is broken. Now, he also considers free and open patents to be an even bigger threat than the patent problem. So he's no friend of the free codecs either. But even he admits that something has to happen. The MPEG will have to adapt or die. We're not waiting around. From 1993, I've been working on codecs and patents, on codecs specifically, originally because I was interested in them. I come from musical theater. I wanted to record things off of soundboard. And at the time, when I was a student, I saved for most of 2 years spare cash to buy a 1 gig hard drive, which I figured could probably hold most of a show. And of course, these days, shows aren't recorded just 2 channels, it's 4 channels, 8 channels. I've worked plenty of shows where I've had 48 channels going into a box. I thought, it's not going to fit. I could probably fit the show more comfortably if it was compressed. I researched what was on the net. I found MP3 back in 1993 and downloaded the dist 8 and then the dist 10 distributions. I remember press at the time saying that MP3 had been liberated by some hacker. Some hacker had found the source code, distributed it to the net at large, like Prometheus. But I'm not sure where the reporters actually got that, because I went to MPEG's FTP site and just downloaded it. It was part of the standard. Part of MPEG and ISO, part of the ISO rules is that your standard has to include a reference implementation, and it did. I downloaded it. Layer 1 audio was not enough compression. Layer 2 audio, you could tell that it had been compressed. It was losing something. Layer 3 sounded absolutely terrible. Now again, this is in 1993. At that time, the idea that MP3 would ever be usable at 128 kilobits a second seemed far-fetched at best. So I discounted lossy compression to begin with and started working on lossless. Our first codec was a codec that you've never heard of called Squish. It was very similar to Shorten. It used a linear predictive encoder, and it was a lossless encoder. A whole bunch of other lossless encoders based around the same math appeared around the same time, Monkey's Audio, MusePack, a whole bunch of others, all based on the same technique. Another thing I found was I got a letter from a company that made a mail transport system called Squish. And they politely but exceedingly firmly told me they had a trademark on this and I was not to use the name. At the time, my machine was a 386. A little later on, I got a 486, which was an improvement. But 28 megahertz 386 does not have a lot of processor. It cannot do very much. You got your 5-cycle adds, you got your 8-cycle multiplies, and 167 for divide, if I recall correctly, something like that. I'm mostly pulling those numbers out of the air, but it was bad. And a friend of mine who was working on the code with me, Mike Whitson, suggested, well, why don't we name it OGG Squish? If you don't know where OGG comes from, it's not actually a Terry Pratchett reference. At the time, there was a popular network game, one of the very first, that ran on Unix workstations. It was one of the first games that you could play over the internet with other people anywhere in the world. Very, very spoiled we were at university in 1993. That's not sarcasm, I mean it. That was some serious computing power. And it was a game where everybody had a little starship. There were 4 factions from the Star Trek television series. There were the Federation and their starships, the Romulans, the Klingons, and the Orions. And it had been played since its inception as sort of a dogfighting game, but the idea was actually to take over planets. You collected armies onto your starship, flew them to another, well, shipped them, flew them, whatever, starship them to another planet and dropped them off. And a player who always appeared as Orion Ship G came up with a new tactic. He was not interested in dogfighting. He would determine which ship had the most armies on it, and he would immediately fly his ship directly into that ship and blow it up. He did this repeatedly. And when you blew up your ship, you instantly got a new one. So it wasn't like dogfighting where you'd be damaged and not able to do anything for a while. He'd blow up his ship, take out all of some faction's armies, and then immediately get a new ship. I cannot tell you how much this pissed off all the other players. It got its own term. It was called ogging. It was simply going straight for it and blowing up in a blaze of glory in some useful way. So Mike suggested we name our system Ogg Squish because it would turn a 386 into a smoking black hole in the ground. The Ogg Squish name stuck, and it's okay, well, we have to retcon this a bit. We'll call the codec Squish still, and we'll call the project Ogg because I knew that we would write more codecs. And so Ogg Squish, yeah, that works. Eventually, we needed a container, and we thought, okay, well, we'll name the container Ogg too. Eventually, I met with a branding expert, and she just shook her head and buried her face in her hands when she heard the way that we mixed and reused the names. But she was a fantastic visual designer. Our website is still using her design. Best money I ever spent. And so Ogg Squish was born and released to the net. This was all a hobby. It was ziff.com back then, but it was still all just a hobby. There was no attempt to make money on it. I was a ranked newbie, and frankly, Ogg Squish wasn't even the best of the lossless compressors out there. I finished my time as an undergraduate and went off to graduate school. I went to Japan because it was a lot more fun than getting a job right away. And I studied at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, Tokodai in Tokyo. And there, although I was in a laboratory that was working on formal verification, I was still very much interested in compression. One of the professors was Sadaoki Furui-san. Oh, forgive me, Furui-sensei. He was a wonderful man, and he noticed that I was interested in compression while I was taking his classes. And so he would stay and talk after classes. He eventually offered, well, why don't you come to my lab at NTT and see some of the things we're working on? His specialty was speech codecs. So he showed me their very nascent speech recognition system, which eventually became the system that controls automated telephone trees all over the world. So when you call and the computer answers, he did that. He was also in his lab at the time working on a successor to MP3 called TwinVQ. Nobody remembers it, I would imagine, but it was a big deal at the time. He brought me to the laboratory and was showing me everything, and I noticed while I was going through the lab that when we went through the lab, all of his grad students would turn their monitors around so I couldn't see what was on them. And it was the most touching thing you could have imagined because someone is taking me seriously. This is wonderful. They didn't want me to see what they were working on. But it was obvious what he was doing because he was teaching classes on speech coding techniques, describing the techniques that were used in speech coding, and he would often slip in a little bit of how TwinVQ worked. Oh, we're working on this thing in our lab, and you can see it's useful because we also use it for this in general purpose coding, and I filed all of this away. I finished my time in Japan, caused a bit of a scandal in my laboratory because what I didn't realize, when I signed up to go get a master's degree, it was always the case that the master's students continued on for a doctorate. And I was not interested in that. And so after breaking an unwritten rule, which my professor was okay with, but still was a bit of a scandal, I hope it didn't actually cause them any trouble, I came back to the States and got a job and kept working on compression in my spare time. Ziff.com continued along. And I noticed that codecs were moving forward very rapidly, but the codecs kept reusing technique after technique after technique. They were all using the same building blocks. It's sort of like how everything you've ever read is the same letters just combined in different combinations to make words, and then sentences, and then paragraphs, and then stories. I got it in my mind that I would build a system, a language that would let you write codecs in a very concise form, and I called it Stormbringer. You've never heard of that either, because it was a fantastic disaster. It went absolutely nowhere. It was not very well designed, but it did get me to touch. Through that, I touched almost every piece of what the state-of-the-art in compression was. Limpel-Ziv, Huffman, arithmetic encoding, the very basic blocks of entropy coding, all the signal processing necessary to work on audio and to some extent video. And so it was an exercise in gaining knowledge. But at the time, I didn't see it that way. At the time, I was ahead of the curve and I was going to monetize this, and the internet bubble was coming. We presented this work to a company called Arepa to try to sell it. They were a video game streaming company. They were trying to do in 1996 what Origin and Steam do now. They had the right idea. They were much too early. There just wasn't enough bandwidth to do what they were trying to do. We tried to sell it to them saying, well, codecs are increasing rapidly. And they said, why do you want to stream codecs? And they said, well, if you have an installed base of codecs and something better comes along, if you're streaming the codec along with everything else, there's no installed base. Everybody instantly upgrades. And I thought, oh, well, maybe we could do something with that. We presented to Apple. Rickland and Mike Person and I, we shipped ourselves off to Cupertino and met with the QuickTime group. I had this ancient Clevo notebook that only a student would consider buying. It was cracked. It tended to overheat, and in fact overheated in the middle of the presentation we were trying to make. And there was a kerfuffle out in the hallway as I'm describing this audio codec building language. And Rickland turns to me and says, it's Steve. And someone popped out in the hall and come back and said, can your system do MP3? I said, well, it could do anything. You just need to write it in the language. Another side out in the hall. Yeah, but can it do it right now? I said, well, no. And I heard from the hall, well, then it sucks. And that was the end of the presentation. The annoying thing about Steve Jobs is not that he was a total jerk. He absolutely was. And that we ran into him just often enough to reinforce that over and over again. The annoying thing about Steve Jobs was that he was right more often than most businessmen. He was fantastically, stupendously, insanely right at least 4 different times in his business career, in addition to being, spectacularly wrong as well. But to be right 4 times and 4 new products and 4 new consumer product revolutions, I hate that word, but he would have used it most likely, is really quite an unusual thing. He knew what he was doing. And I thought about that presentation for a good long time. Of course, at the time, it was terribly demoralizing. We did nothing with codecs for perhaps a year. I just put it down. I couldn't even look at it. But it started creeping back in because I had learned a lot. I was actually reasonably good at it, or at least I thought I was. I think I was. And I kept thinking about it. But what codec am I going to write? No one wants a system to write codecs. They want codecs. That was very clear from the presentation to Apple. What codec am I going to write? What niche isn't filled? And then in 1998, September of 1998, Fraunhofer Thompson sent cease and desist letters to all of the free MP3 encoder projects. Lame, Blade, 8 Hertz, all of them got these letters saying, shut down the project or we sue you. That was quite a clarifying moment. That was a split second of, well, now I know what codec I need to write. I need to replace MP3. That's very, very simple. Several of these projects, Lame in particular, came up with the idea that, well, if we don't distribute binaries, we don't distribute complete source, we're just a patch set. That'll let us get around the whole thing and we can keep moving our project forward. And that turned out to be a reasonably good call. And Lame was never sued or challenged again in any way. But MPEG in general was actually playing things a little smarter than I gave them credit for at the beginning. I don't think they had any intention of suing anyone. They just wanted to keep the horses in the barn, because if they lose control of their intellectual property, then they're not going to make, they're going to lose, when they lose control, they lose money, they lose their leverage, they lose their place inside this moat of protective monopoly that patent grants them. But I didn't exactly see it that way at the time. At the time, I was absolutely incensed that this group would come in and take away from these free projects all the work that they had done to make MP3 popular for MPEG. MPEG probably had bigger plans for MP3 all along, but at the time, the biggest push they'd made was to license it for use as hold music on bonded ISDN lines. That's game-changing. Meanwhile, these hackers, these ingrates, had taken this code and had built an entire new music ecosystem on the internet with it. No help. They'd done all the marketing themselves, if you could call it that. That makes it very corporate speak. But they made MP3 what it was. They made it popular. They put it on the scene. And they got slapped in the face for it. Yeah, what they were doing was technically illegal, but everyone believed that MP3 was free up to that point, and MPEG played their cards smart in the sense that, although they went after these groups, probably no one outside of free source ever realized that that had happened. Up to the day that the final MP3 patent expired in 2017, most of the world thought MP3 was free to use for anything. Businesses knew better. And it wasn't about the money. It was not just about the money. I worked for a company somewhat later named Greenwich Internet Radio, one of the first streaming sites on the net. One of the first, not the first. And we licensed MP3 encoders and had a giant library of music that we bought at local music stores in San Francisco. One of the stories that goes along with this was they contacted me and said, hey, you want to come join our internet company? I said, what are you doing? Oh, we're doing streaming radio. And I thought, finally, someone's heard of Vorbis. We're going to revolutionize streaming on the internet. No, it was a different program I'd written. I'd written CD Paranoia, and they had 140,000 CDs to rip. They simply wanted my advice on how to keep it going. I took the offer, at which point I told them about Vorbis, and they were interested in that too. But when I joined the company, the biggest problem they had was how to rip 140,000 CDs. They were considering very large automated robot systems to just change CDs all day with standard CD changers or standard CD-ROMs to rip all these CDs. When someone pointed out that there was an art school down the road that had just let out for the summer, and art school students on break looking for money was way cheaper than any CD robot that they could have bought. So we hired all the art school grad students, and they came in and just changed CDs all day. And they loved it. They loved the job for the most part. I don't recall any malcontents. They thought working for an internet music company was the coolest thing ever. For one thing, we quietly let them borrow CDs and listen to them, and paid reasonably well. This was the bubble. Paid really well. Still so much cheaper than CD robots. But while I was working for the company, Thomson Multimedia bought a controlling interest in one of our competitors, Music Match, the Music Match jukebox, which was also an internet streaming company. Now, we'd been licensing our MP3 encoders, and we were using them live, which meant that when someone connected, they got a radio stream that was personalized to them, and that was being encoded on the fly. We needed to license the encoders to be allowed to do that. We were paying a few $1,000s a year for it. You know, not nothing, but not a lot. And once Thomson bought an interest in Music Match, the fee for those encoders for the next year went up to $60 million. That was list price. This is why free, reasonable, and non-discriminatory is essentially meaningless, because everybody's getting a discount if they're paying at all. If you're inside the moat, if you have a little bit of control of the process, if you're one of the haves, you're one of the haves, you get the technology. If you're outside the moat, and God forbid you're competing with someone inside the moat, you get none of that. You pay list price. Hey, that's fair. You knew the price up front. In any case, that was the first, my first run-in with free, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. It would not be the last. As it turns out, Greenwich got bought by a company called iCast, but they still had enough control to say, no, we're not going to license that. And they ended up dumping a lot of their money into Vorbis development. They were our first big sponsor. I put that in somewhat saltier terms in the first talk, but I think this one's being streamed, so I have to keep it family friendly. They were our first sponsor, and then the internet bubble burst and everyone got laid off. So we had Vorbis. When we were at iCast, we started a video codec called Tarkin. Tarkin was a neat idea that was a terrible idea in reality. The idea was to take a whole bunch of frames of video, the video, pixels. One frame is essentially a still image. You have pixels in both directions. If you stack them up, it's like a cube of pixels. So instead of using a two-dimensional transform, we'll use a three-dimensional transform. And that obsoletes motion compensation. Makes it all very easy. It turns out that causes artifacts in both directions in time, and the effect is really disturbing. Anyone remember all the deep dream stuff that Google was doing, the neural net for enhancing images that ended up seeing eyeballs and everything? The effect was a little like that, in that everything started moving before it was moving. People didn't go from point A to point B. They sort of shifted like one of those sand animations. And it was like, oh, that's horrifying. So Tarkin didn't go anywhere, but we needed a video codec. We were no longer employed by anybody. We were just free hackers working again, waiting till the next job came along. When a company called On2, formerly Duck Technologies, was hopping on the open source bandwagon. They had some reasons to, that it wasn't just completely out of the blue. And they had a codec called VP3 that they were open sourcing, and no one took them seriously. So we contacted them. They said, hey, we'll give it to you. Sure, we'll donate the patents, give you the source. Oh, and by the way, there's this service contract we really want to get out of. If you take on the service contract to maintain this code, it's yours. So we took it. Service contract turned out not to be a very big problem. The code itself was idiosyncratic. They were obviously they were obviously self-taught, obviously very bright. They knew what they were doing. But the code was parochial. It's clear that they hadn't really researched the state of the art. It was all very much invented there. But we had a video codec. VP3 became the Theora codec in, I think we finally released it in 2004, but it was essentially 1998 technology, about the same age as Vorbis. And at the time, it did not perform very well. To put it mildly. But we were getting some attention and we were getting some traction, and people were beginning to take the free software stuff more seriously because we were actually getting Vorbis into devices and so on. There's some stories about that as well. Things had been fairly smooth sailing up to this point. I mean, yeah, we'd ridden out some storms, but no one had threatened to sue us. No one had even made any noise about it. The press loved us, the community loved us. Hey, this is great. And around that time, the first real resistance started, and the party line of the commercial outlets was that you don't want to use Theora because it's proprietary. It's like, it's proprietary? Well, sure, On2 made it, but they open sourced it. We have it right here. We have all the patents. We have a patent license that says you can use it for absolutely anything, no restrictions, no control. You don't even need to explicitly license it. All you have to do is acknowledge you used it, acknowledge that you're using it and give us credit and it's yours. They said, no, but it's made by a single organization with no outside input. I said, what are you talking about, no outside input? And they said, no, you don't understand. It sucks, it's proprietary, and it sucks. And went, no, it is not proprietary. We developed an IRC. Anyone could come along and contribute to it. We published the minutes of our meetings. Everything was out in the open, and any individual could come along and help us with it. But that was the story of the time. Because it was a single organization's product, it was automatically proprietary. It also became clear at that time that the sucks part was actually really true. then we needed to improve it. I had said that Onto's style of encoder writing was kind of parochial. That's true, and so we rewrote the whole thing and found out that there was an awful lot of space there for improvement. We attracted a whole bunch of new people into the org during that time. Tim Terraberry, who was head of the Dollar Project and is now one of the AV1 bigwigs here in ZIF and at Mozilla, showed up at that time. We rewrote the whole thing. We squeezed out enough performance to match H.264's baseline, not the low complexity, but the medium complexity, which was quite a thing at the time. This was a 1998 codec keeping up with H.264. But we knew secretly in the organization, we would admit it if asked directly, but we knew secretly within the organization and didn't really like talking about the fact that that was probably the end of the line for it. It wasn't going to get much farther. We were holding the line until we got more resources, the ability to handle more, the ability to do more with video, but Theora was running out of steam. We had actually been talking to Onto off and on during this entire time. They were up to VP8. Their VP6 had gotten into Flash, which was a huge thing for them, but they were once again having trouble getting traction with their newer codecs. They were up to VP8, and we were in talks. We were talking to them. I'm not sure how seriously they were taking it, but they were at least returning our emails and discussing it seriously. We were talking with them of acquiring VP8 and all the patents up to that point. It's like, hey, hand us your patent portfolio. And surprisingly, they didn't say anything nasty. They're like, you know what, we'll talk about it. And then they stopped returning email. So, that's strange. They just went silent. Did we say something? I mean, the whole exercise was ludicrous to begin with, but they didn't laugh us out the door at the beginning, so maybe we did something wrong. And then in December, it turned out that they'd been bought by Google. So missed it by that much. Not that it was likely they were going to grant us all those, but So Google bought Onto, and the speculation was at the time that they would open source VP8, which they did. And really, that's turned out to be better than if we had gotten control of the IP, because Google, of course, has all of these resources. Google is not really a company to be trusted, but I find that they are, the motto, don't be evil, I think that they have quietly stepped past now that they have noticed just how much business flexibility they get from amorality. I wouldn't call them evil, I wouldn't call them guilty, but they're certainly not innocent anymore. Regardless, they had a lot of resources, and if you ask me, would I rather cooperate with Google now or, say, Microsoft of the mid-90s, there's no question I'd rather cooperate with Google now. Mostly the annoyance comes from the way they do things. They're more insular than you would think, and yet at the same time, there's a great deal more infighting in the company than you would think. Even at its height, Microsoft was a feudal society with internal divisions at war, straight up war a lot of the time. And Google is more, everyone's moving so fast that no one knows what anyone is doing. But more than that, no one cares what anyone else is doing. I'm sure most of you have seen the American comic strip Dilbert. And one of the famous Dilberts is the Bungie manager who bungees in, makes a bunch of proclamations, and is yanked right back out the window. And throughout development with Google, their engineers feel that way sometimes. I like to call it the grad student problem. Well, the code didn't get finished because the grad student graduated. Or rather, the grad student graduated and the code was declared finished. That happens to some amount. But at the time, it actually felt pretty good. We had Google on our side in a very public way, and it felt like finally we could let go of a losing proposition because we'd done well with Theora up to that point, but things were going to go bad very soon because in another 2 years it wasn't going to keep up anymore. So Google had VP8. Google open sourced VP8. Google immediately drew a ton of patent backlash from everyone who didn't want to see free codecs. And they were taken seriously in a way that we never were. And we saw a lot of things come out of the woodwork, a lot of patent food, a lot of, this is an obvious ripoff of what MPEG was doing. It wasn't. Onto knew what they were doing. They knew where the lines were. They knew what the patent said. Onto had an annoying tendency to step right up to the line and then tap dance a little bit, but they knew where the line was, and they did not go over it. was it, that's irrelevant. But at the time, it's like we can finally let go and do something new. And one of the things we started working on at that time was Opus. And that's where things started getting really interesting, because now suddenly free software has arrived. You see companies actively fighting against the free software. You know, they laugh at you, then they fight at you, then they fight you, then you win. Well, we had been through a sort of 10-year period of sort of increasingly nervous laughter, and the fight was coming. We went to one of the problems with Vorbis that became apparent toward the end of development was that I had schooled myself with what NTT had done with TwinVQ. I'd studied very closely what Fraunhofer Thompson had done with MP3, Fraunhofer Thompson, Philips, all the others, because it was a codec by committee. And I'd studied very closely what Fraunhofer had done with AAC. I had studied all the published technical information, the papers. I knew how all of these things worked inside and out. And as I wrote my own codec, Vorbis, I discovered that nothing in any of these papers worked the way they claimed. Well, the very basics, yes. The MDCT works the way that Brandenburg and Sporer and so on published. But their descriptions of the multiple encoding loops, the noise optimization, the optimal distribution of quantization noise as being the best way to design an audio codec, I discovered that none of it was true. Absolutely none of it was true. It was plausible. And it sort of worked. But there was always, if you dug and tried enough things and experimented, some other obvious way that it worked better. And I discovered at the end that the single most important thing in an audio codec is to keep the energy consistent in each critical band. Now, that's very technical. It's not going to be on any sort of quiz, and it's certainly not going to appear in any in anything you're required to know. But I discovered this, and the first thing I did was tell the free MP3 encoder projects that were still around. And that's when Lame took a huge leap forward. That's when a couple others took a huge leap forward. Vorbis took a huge leap forward. But Vorbis wasn't really designed to take advantage of this. I had believed the technical hype. I had believed the things that I'd read. I had believed that MP3 would never make it to 128 kilobits. I thought that was a fantastic holy grail to shoot for. I designed the Vorbis packet structure to hit sort of an efficiency sweet spot around there. And as the expected bit rate that you had to work at got lower and lower and lower, then the packet overhead became higher and higher and higher. It got farther out of the sweet spot. Opus, on the other hand, was a codec written from the ground up to use these lessons from Vorbis. In some ways, it was Vorbis 2.0. Even though you look at it and see technically, they have almost nothing in common. They're completely different codecs. But it used all of the lessons from Vorbis. We got to work on Opus, which was a wonderful thing. We started to work on Dala, which was a wonderful thing. Meanwhile, the patent wars around VP8 continued. I noticed that everyone who gleefully wrote about how Google was being sued for obviously infringing, I mean, it was obvious, everyone knew they were infringing on VP8. Google won all those lawsuits. Did you know that? No, no one reported it. Google won them all. Florian Mueller didn't even mention it. There was a lot of reporting around the fact that when Google licensed, it's not clear what Google actually licensed from MPEG to keep VP8 and VP9 out of the spotlight. They basically bought silence from MPEG. It's very much the case that, especially in the United States, you can sue for anything. It doesn't have to have any basis whatsoever. Effectively, patent barratry is legal in the United States. It is up to the defendant to prove that they don't infringe. And so that could have kept going on for a while. Now, Google did something that looked very, very bad. They said, hey, we'll give you some amount of money to buy your silence forever. And MPEG looked at the patent portfolio they actually had, and VP8 said, yeah, we'll take it. So Google bought silence. And it was probably very, very cost effective. For a small amount of money to Google, tens of millions, maybe as high as 100 million, I don't know, much less than MPEG would have gotten in royalties for a real license from anyone else over the period of 10 years, Google bought silence in eternity. Lots of people like to say Google lost that translation. Well, they lost it in the public eye, for sure. It didn't look good. I think that they made out pretty well, actually. That was the kind of solution, though, that only Google could pull off. They're the only ones who had the resources for that. This cycle is happening again with AV1, of course. But I also know for a fact that Google doesn't really want anyone to talk about it. Google has this weird thing. I asked them, why don't you defend yourselves more in public? Especially when, having been involved in the technical side of things, I know you're in the right. And the response from the VP in question, again, no names, was, company policy, we don't argue with stupid people. And it's like, I'm really glad you didn't say that in public. They just want it to be quiet. They want it out of the news cycle. They want to continue moving along and moving things forward. They do not care how guilty people think they are. So I guess we get to move that along. We get to do some amount of that defense for them. But honestly, I'm not going to say an awful lot about AV1 today because they want everyone to keep quiet. And honestly, they're in a real sense, they're right, because whatever kerfuffle happens around AV1, it's going to be resolved in their favor, and everyone's going to forget about it. So what's with all the noise and fury signifying nothing? Sadly, I do not have my notes with me, but there are a whole bunch of other things. What is the time? 46. Oh, good. Okay. So that was, am I here for 1 hour or 2? 1? 1 hour?
That's exactly what I thought. 1 hour?
Okay. So at this point, there's an awful lot else out there, including a lot of things that I'm not going to talk about on a live stream. But my boss asked me, so what are you going to be talking about? And I said, well, I suggested AV1, but Petter wanted something. I kept throwing you under the bus, I'm sorry. But Petter wanted something clickbait. And my boss just said, okay, don't tell the lawyers. Yeah, as long as this doesn't get back to them, I'm good. I'd have to go back to the beginning and pick out fun and interesting things about, patent holdup, the work we did around the FTC. It's hard to say if the FTC actually took any of it seriously. Stuff around OGG and CD paranoia. Oh, the OGG format wars. It was a weird thing to see Google adopt Matroska, the container, for WebM. And all the people who hated OGG suddenly hated Matroska too. It's like, what? Where did that come from? I mean, honestly, we'd had some fairly heated arguments with the Matroska people back when the Matroska project started, mostly because it was the thing that we had intended to do next, and they were doing it a different way than we wanted to. So of course there was going to be some heated tempers, but structurally the two containers are very, very similar. The encoding is entirely different, of course, but the structural idea is the same. And that hatchet is long buried. Still, it was weird to see the hate being directed at Matroska for no real reason. And then, of course, everyone except Google has just decided to use MP4 and Dash. So your minimum latency on any stream is like 10 seconds. The way adaptive streaming is done in MPEG-4, MPEG-4 can't stream because the index has to be at the front of the file. So you do streaming either by doing CBR and guessing at the index at the beginning, or you do it by encoding a file in chunks. Every MPEG-4 stream is actually a series of self-contained MPEG-4 files that are either 2 seconds, 6 seconds, or 10 seconds long. You do adaptive streaming, and it's constant bit rate in there. And you do adaptive streaming by simply changing the bit rate between chunks. And that's why the latencies are so long. The broadcast people, of course, don't mind because they're used to that kind of latency. In the audio world, where low latency means 5 milliseconds, not 15 seconds, that feels like cheating, but it seems like the world is getting along all right with that. Oh my God, is that my power supply? I'm going to have internet tonight. All right, I can go back over and see what all I've missed. But really, I should open things up to questions because I think at the Cisco presentation I gave earlier, I ended up talking for almost 2 hours and didn't notice. So that would probably be bad. No, I get to keep talking? Let's see if this poor thing actually boots. This is my workshop machine. It lives in a workshop, in a metal shop, where it controls CNC machines. I was going to bring something smaller and lighter and started building it, but then I started improving it. You know how that goes. Anyway, I pulled this thing off of my mill. It's been sitting in my workshop for like 12 years. It's covered in chemical burns on the front. It looks like dust, but it's not. So let's boot this and see what actually happens. Oh God, what's going to come up on the screen? But one of the side effects of having this machine is that it's approximately 12 years old and has the original battery. So the battery literally lasts 45 seconds. I tried to get my notes off of it, boot it, get onto the network and get my notes off of it, and it died as it was authenticating. Because I left my power supply at Cisco this morning like a dummy. Well, I mean, there's not really all that much there. I did go on for an hour. Honestly, I hate these kind of delays in presentations because I know that it just breaks the flow of the whole thing. But things get very disjoint when I'm not going from notes. Oh. Hotspot login. Oh, here we go. I love every meme that's ever happened, thus the background. Okay, NRK loves me. It's a bassoon. I play bassoon. Will it see another display? We're finally there. Oh my goodness, it does. (1024 by 768), yeah. Oops, now I don't have a display over here. Well, I'll just control minus this and. So all of that work? That was my only slide. But what I did actually want was my notes. So I will pop this back to the big deal was actually the. Oh, did it go bad? Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm usually a little bitter about that. Okay, let me get mine back. Yeah, keep the changes. Oh no, what horrible thing has happened? For anyone who is wondering if Wayland was entirely ready to use yet, I believe the answer is no. silly thing is eating my mouse cursor. I have no pointer. I have no input at all. Oh, I see what has happened. You have become my primary display. The saddest part of all of this is that I wrote some of the software. And it's putting the settings on the other monitor where the mouse can't get to. And that is why a firmware power button is the most glorious thing in the universe. All right. I don't want to end my time in silence frittering with this thing. I will bring it back up because someone was nice enough to bring this to me. Oh, you suspended, did you? That's nice. Why did you do that? Better. One of the things that happened, actually, if I'm just going to keep telling stories, one of the things that happened early in the days of Vorbis, when we were trying to get onto our first hardware device, I met with a company called iObjects. They were making small portable players on the ARM platform. This is long before the iPod or iPhone. I think the Diamond Rio was. Did I do that?
Yes, it's a band.
The other fun part of this is that I'm actually a sound guy, and so I'm usually the one doing all the adjustments on the actors and secretly cursing them for being such dolts on stage. This is a Countryman E6, is it not? What's him? Oh, okay. Similar, looked very similar. Technology keeps marching forward. But I had an actor one night break 3 of them on stage in an amateur troupe. By sweating. He was a big guy. One of the things that happened when we were first getting Vorbis onto devices, working with iRiver, and in this particular case I will name names, Mark Phillips. I don't hate you, but I'm still sad about the whole thing. He needed a integer Vorbis decoder for his devices. And I thought, this is wonderful, we will get onto a hardware device. So I started writing it, and we went back and forth, we cooperated. There was no contract, but I had worked with them before, and so I wasn't feeling too bad about that. We finished the decoder, it ran real time on the device, working fairly well. This was a device called the HipZip. It was actually released. It was a little player that took these tiny little floppy disks in a metal can called iOmega clicks, or iOmega pocket zips, depending on where they were being sold. And they were fantastically unreliable. But Vorbis was working on the device, and we thought this was wonderful. I have an integer decoder. I can give this to all sorts of people. Mark's take on it was a little different. He said, well, congratulations, you've passed your you've passed your employment test. And I'm like, what are you talking about? It's like, well, you passed the interview. You did good work. We'd like to hire you. No, what are you talking about? This was a work for hire. It's like, oh, no. You were doing this for us to prove that you were worth hiring. No. I was writing you an integer decoder and spent really quite a long time on it. There was a lot of loud, harsh words between us on that account. And eventually I hired a lawyer. Lawyers are wonderful things, by the way, when they're good and they work for you. Because among other things, aside from people taking them seriously, they're master negotiators. And the lawyer said to me, the most wonderful thing, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, don't worry about it. You don't have to talk to him anymore. My problem now. So I took this off, and eventually I heard from him, it's like, "Hey, Mark is not going to budge on this." And I said, "Well, that's very simple. He has the source code because we worked on it together. He's not going to pay for it, so I think everyone gets the source code." And I just open sourced the entire for-hire project, which he was incensed by. We were giving away his proprietary technology, which of course he hadn't paid for and wasn't willing to pay for. I pointed that out. And so he told me that he was going to blacklist me and I would never work in the industry again. Wonderful fellow. About 5 years ago, he contacted me. He said, "Oh, I'm passing through Boston and was going to go get a drink. Do you want to, I understand if you don't want to talk to me, but do you maybe want to get together and hash things out?" And I just didn't respond. Let me see if I can actually get my notes and stop fiddling with the silliness. I suppose that one counts as a real war story in a sense. Okay. I imagine people here actually want to go home sometime. So I'm a little sorry about this. Oh, you didn't. Do I have a mouse cursor over here at least? Okay. Here. Come over here. Come over here. No, over here. Give me an Emacs. I'm going to bring you over here. No more fussing. All right. How many people have heard the blue banana story? I don't care. How many people have heard the blue banana story? Really? Oh, this is a one. Oh, okay. Oh, of course. This is a wonderful one. Is it only because I told it earlier, Steinar? Yeah, okay. This is a wonderful one. In the early days of the Americans, us Americans, developing color television as a backwards compatible add-on to the existing black and white television system, working on the NTSC standard, even then jokingly referred to as never the same color. The first public demonstration broadcast from RCA headquarters to a number of stations around the States was being conducted. It was a very simple demonstration. It was a single NTSC camera pointed at a still life, just a bowl of fruit. While they were setting this up, an engineer who felt that he was very secure in his job plucked the banana out of the bowl, painted it blue, and put it back without telling anybody. For the rest of the day, all of the engineers at the receiving stations were trying to figure out what the hell was wrong with their receivers. No matter what adjustment they made, either the banana was blue or everything else looked wrong. He was taken aside and told never to do that again. But it says something about the mindset of engineers that they never considered that it's just possible the banana was actually blue. Okay. Oh yes, the very first mention we ever got in public press of the OGG project was when we released the first alpha of OGG Vorbis. The first people to ever put us in print anywhere was Streaming Media magazine. I keep thinking in my mind it was their first print issue, but I don't think that could possibly have been true. They took pictures of us for the magazine cover, of which I can find no record whatsoever. I had an issue at the time. I know it exists, but I didn't save it because at the time I never would have thought of saving any of these things. It just felt like a crazy ride. But throughout the article, they spelled it Og Dorbis. That was our first encounter with the press. Overall, actually, the press has been really quite nice to us. We did learn not to trust reporters that we did not know. The Wall Street Journal after Vorbis had been out for a few years, and we were actually making some inroads with Fiora, and it looked like the project was still picking up a little bit of steam. The Wall Street Journal sent a reporter, which was, you know, a big deal. This is the Wall Street Journal in the United States. They were going to put one of those little woodcut pictures of me in the paper, the whole thing. It's like, heck yes, I want to talk to the Wall Street Journal. The lady reporter came, and as it turned out, what she wanted to write about was how open source hackers were all destitute and open source ruined lives. When I moved back to Boston, which had just happened when the Wall Street Journal had called, this was right after the bubble had burst, and I'd moved back to New England because New England was home. I didn't have the cushy ICAST job with Greenwich Internet Radio anymore, so I came back to New England, which was home. My buddy, a buddy of mine, Chris Provenzano, had just made some money in the bubble as well. I paid off my student loans. He made a little more than I did, so he bought a house. It was a rundown what was then known as Slummerville, because it was the only place in town that anyone could still afford to buy houses. And it was old. The carpeting was original to the 50s. It had been electrified at some point haphazardly. The ceilings were kind of falling down. The walls were not in good shape. It was kind of rickety. And he had planned to buy this house and, you know, slowly over a couple of years, gut it and renovate it. When the reporter from the Wall Street Journal showed up, the house was just in its native 50 years of rundown state where no one had taken care of it. My desk was completely full of, well, computer crap. I mean, I'm an engineer. And so I thought, well, this can't do, she can't sit here. I pulled a folding table out of the basement and the legs out and set it up and got some folding chairs so we could sit down there and talk. And she wrote about how I couldn't afford a desk and I had to use folding furniture. She wrote about how open source had destroyed my marriage. I'd been very briefly married before that. Believe me, open source had nothing to do with that falling apart. She was a wonderful lady, and I was impressed as hell by her, and still am, but that's not a recipe for actually getting along in day-to-day life. That's not enough. You need more than that, and we didn't have it. My mother, a pious Christian woman in the American mold that I know that foreigners think of all Americans as very strangely religious, and often it's true. And my mother is one of these people. She pulled me aside and said, "Honey, you really should have tried living together. That wasn't very smart." But the reporter wrote about how open source had obviously destroyed my marriage and made me destitute living in this rundown house in Boston. It was more about and she tracked down my ex-wife, tried to get her to comment on the whole thing, and Dana, to her credit, wouldn't give her the time of day. So yeah, the reporters are often looking to tell the story they want actual circumstances and reality be damned. I guess. Oh, I actually got that. Oh, this is one of my favorite. When we first started working on improving Fiora, because Fiora sucked, was proprietary and sucked, we knew that proprietary wasn't a fair charge, but suck certainly was. The next version I had codenamed Thuznelda, which no one outside of Europe, or at least outside of Germany, had any idea what that was, and it's like the names that you people keep coming up with are the worst. Oh, I had someone on Slashdot tell me that it was obvious we didn't know how to name things, so he was going to come up with a new name for Vorbis for us, and it would be make it a marketing success. Of course, his idea was free MP3. That's great. We'll not be taking that. I named a new version of Fiora Thuznelda. It's actually named after a PDQ Bach piece. Thuznelda is the queen in PDQ Bach's "The Queen to Me a Royal Pain Doth Give." And so people on Reddit took exception to this and said, "Come on, guys, seriously? Here, I have some names to suggest for you." Now, this guy knew what he was doing. His suggested names were Snupflog, Brathafrage, Bortnax, Tolobvorm, and Nortwat. And we used them all. So the release of, the next release after Thisnelda was in fact Talavorm. We used Snupflog for a release of Vorbis. Yeah, these all had legs. They were great names. Oh yeah, the last run-in with Steve Jobs. Well, he's dead now. I don't really have to worry about him anymore. One of the free software people wrote Steve Jobs about Thisnelda, about Theora, saying, you know, why don't you guys use it? It's free. And Steve actually wrote him back. It was a legitimate reply from Steve Jobs that said, well, you know, they can't make a video codec because it's impossible. All possible ways of making a video codec are patented. I mean, it's just self-obvious. I'm adding the it's just self-obvious. I believe the exact response was, here it is, all video codecs are covered by patents. A patent pool is being assembled to go after Theora. We heard that about Vorbis, we hear about Theora, we heard it about VP8, and now we're hearing it about AV1. It's like if they space these things out by 5 years, no one's going to remember the pattern that they've set. It's being assembled to go after Theora and the other open source codecs. Just because something is open source, it doesn't mean or guarantee that it doesn't infringe on others' patents. An open standard is different from being royalty-free or open source. Now, leaving aside the fact that the last two statements are true, the clear implication is that we do not have any idea what we're doing and we're a bunch of idiots. Thanks, Steve. Anyway, we're still around. We outlasted him, so that's fine. Apple's using AV1 now, so. Oh, I'm a little sore about Steve Jobs. I mean, I'm not glad he died. I'm just, yeah, what was RMS's really inflammatory quote on it? Yeah, I don't remember, but I don't quite feel that way. I don't feel it's a good idea to speak ill of the dead, but the guy really was a jerk. In any case, Google selected Vorbis for WebM. Oh, here's another little one. We'll close on this one. This will be the last thing I'll take up your time with. In 2016, Jean-Marc, who was the driving force behind the Opus codec, I had started a new codec to replace Vorbis called Ghost, and he had started a new codec to replace Vorbis called Kelt at the time. Kelt turned into Opus and became a great success, and Ghost never saw the light of day. But Jean-Marc noticed when he was going through the EVS specification, the Enhanced Video Services specification from 3GPP, which is what all new cell phones are running, that Opus was getting referenced in a bunch of their implementation papers. Well, that's interesting. And so he pulled up the source code, and lo and behold, there was our reference implementation. So the next generation 3GPP enhanced voice services are partly built on top of Opus. And the niftiest part of that is it sucked in all of our patents. Of course, we would only be interested in them for defensive purposes. We would never assert them for any other reason. As far as I'm concerned, everyone who's doing EVS is more than welcome to all this stuff. It feels really good to have work validated that way, and if anything, if anyone was worried about the safety of Opus, there's your safety right there. The average open source hacker gets kind of nervous around patents. You know, you're not really sure how to handle them because it's sort of the plaything of rich companies. But at the same time, the standard way of doing business in big companies is not, I have patents, I sue you. It's, I have patents, I'm safe. You know, Microsoft used to be a bunch of real jerks about trying to wipe out all competition. We all remember that. Everyone still sort of thinks they're that way, and occasionally they are. They've reformed an awful lot, and I don't want to keep beating on Microsoft for things they're no longer doing. They really have reformed in a number of important ways. Microsoft still amasses patents, but they're primarily doing so as a defensive measure because they're absolutely terrified of being sued out of the water. They're one of the few people that got sued big time over MP3 and lost. Back when they were, saying that they were going to indemnify people to use their MP3 encoder, not actually MP3 implementation that was not actually related to the lawsuits, but the simple fact is it was a bluff. There's no way you could do that. No one is big enough to take on that kind of indemnification. Microsoft was no exception. In any case, we have all of these patents that all of these companies are getting, and it's all about, I have patents, you have patents, a war isn't worth it. Mutually assured destruction, mutually assured destruction. Well, how about we actually sit down and go get a beer instead? Now that we have patents, people take us seriously, and it is the weirdest thing in the universe. And so our patents getting sucked into EVS instantly makes Opus safer for everyone else. It's kind of a neat, weird, and oh my God, I just sounded upbeat about software patents. That's not entirely right. To make it clear, I still think software patents are a terrible idea as implemented right now. But on the other hand, if we have to be in the middle of this, we're in a safer place than we used to be. So that at least is a good thing. Anyway, oh, my terrible desktop. That has been my desktop since I was a student in college. First color machine. Not the background, that's a meme from just a couple of years ago, but the horrible blue X terms and the Emacs. Why do you want to brown to Emacs? Well, I don't. It was always brown. And I think that's pretty much it. I've gone on for too long. And if anyone wants to say or ask anything else, great. Otherwise, I guess everyone can go home and I can go do laundry.
Any questions?
If they turn off the stream, I'm willing to talk about a lot more than I was during the talk.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And thank you very much for all of your work.
To be clear, I've done the work because it was fun and I wanted to do it. So, just going on with that.
Best kind. You have a wonderful pair of videos that you put up teaching people about audio codecs and digitalization and whatever. And in there you point out that for good human perceptual reasons you like that 16 bits and 44.1 kilohertz is good enough for everyone.
Good enough for playback.
For
good enough for last mile delivery of music, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Are there any similar rules of thumb for video?
Interesting question. I think the answer is yes, and interestingly enough, everyone has backed off from it. No one is interested in making video transparent because it reveals all the artifice that goes into making a compelling video. Going right to probably the example that everyone would remember is Peter Jackson filming installments in the Lord of the Rings movies in 48 frames per second. And the counterintuitive feeling that people reported that it felt fake. It was so much clearer, there was less motion blur, you could see more easily what was going on. People reported that rather than being immersed in a movie, it felt like I was looking at a set. The veil that the very low frame rate, and 24 hertz is a very low frame rate in terms of human perceptual ability, the veil that it lends makes the craft easier in a lot of ways and makes the video feel less real. And that's usually what video is going for. So to answer your question, yes, there probably is. It has been studied. I know that 12-bit color is where people generally feel that that's enough color depth given the gammas that are normally used in video representation. I do not know what an equivalent frame rate would be. I know what an equivalent resolution would be, but only measured in terms of arc seconds. Because, of course, the closer you are to what you're looking at, the bigger the pixels are. Yes? Oh, I have to remember to repeat questions before answering them. Oh, I'm sorry, you have a microphone, so it's all very clear. Yes, that's right.
First of all, thank you for everything. Next, it's like, where are we going from now? It's like, someone's been following you for lots of years. So it's like, is there something you can tell about now?
Oh, yeah. Aside from exciting things that happen that make the news, and I'm usually talking about some sort of disaster like a lawsuit, the vast majority of all of this is just work. There's a lot of work to be left to be done technically on AV1 now that we have the spec before it is usable by everyone. What I mean is that we have a good software decoder. There are hardware decoders coming. We do not yet have a good software encoder. libaom produces good results, but it is far, far, far too slow to seriously suggest that anyone actually use in production, YouTube's rollout notwithstanding. It is simply too slow to be useful. Hardware encoders are coming, but the reason it is slow is not because it's inherently that much more complex, it's because it is so young. And we really haven't. The libaom implementation that we have is a proof of concept that each of the encoding tools that we've built into the codec are worth it. And I don't think a single one of them, with perhaps the exception of the deblocking filter, and I'm going to say that because I wrote the Ravi version of the deblocking filter. And I know that we found a really great trick to make that one incredibly fast. With the exception of that, I don't think that there's any part of the codec that you can look at and say, well, it looks like it's doing an exhaustive search, but exhaustive is sort of, how you define it. It's not really. There are solutions it's missing, and it's doing it too slowly. AV1 will be encoding real-time in software without any substantial CPU advancements once we are done with it. You know how far it is from that right now. That's an indication of how much work we have to do on a software encoder. And I mention a software encoder specifically because that's what I'm working on right now, and that's what my head is in as an engineer. Aside from AV1, Opus penetration needs to continue. There will probably be, well, not probably be an AV2. Google already thinks they're working on AV2. The rest of the world would like to disagree. There will probably be another video codec. MPEG's already working on one. VVC has been announced. There's nothing actually there yet, but it's been announced. There will be more video codecs in the world. There will be another audio codec. I would love to actually spend some time working on a new lossless codec, because we've learned a lot of math since the days of LPC encoders. Is the math good enough to make lossless files even smaller? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's probably going to be fun to play with. I'm motivated more by what's fun to work on at this point than what I absolutely critically need to work on right now. Especially since what I absolutely critically need to work on right now is the AV1 encoder, and hey, you have to have some way to blow off steam. So the work that continues right now is the obvious work. We've gotten to the point where we have AV1, but we don't really. And we'll continue working on AV1 until we really do have it, everyone can actually use it, and we can actually call it done as opposed to just sort of mission accomplished. Okay.
Well, I think I will close it with thank you very much.